Hey there, it's Christian from 7 Gaming Network, and I'm here today with a video to explain a little bit about deck building in Star Wars Destiny, and more specifically how we can deck build bearing in mind our strategy. And strategy is the main element of our deck building I'm going to focus on today. Just right from the off, Team Covenant have also done a really excellent deck building video that if you're new to Destiny and you're still trying to work all this out, is very, very helpful. They've got a lot of good hints and tips in there. But I want to focus very specifically on how you pick your strategy and then how you build to your strategy in Star Wars Destiny. So let me just define strategy and what I mean by that, because that's a word that we can use a lot in these kind of games and we don't necessarily know exactly what we are talking about. So generally we would talk about strategy and tactics, and the easy way to think about it is strategy is your big overarching aim. Like what's the big idea that you are trying to achieve in this instance with your deck. And then tactics tends to be the sort of turn by turn, round by round, nitty gritty decisions that you might use or take to see your strategy come about. Okay, so the strategy really is the big picture. And it becomes absolutely essential when you're deck building to constantly bear in mind what the strategy is. And Star Wars Destiny is a game that rewards really tight deck building, bearing in mind our strategy. We have only 30 cards in the deck to play with. So that means that every card that you include is really important. It can have a big swing on the game, just one card at the right time. Now, the other thing is that we're also, of course, using dice in Destiny, and because dice are a factor and cards, there is the potential for lots and lots of randomness. Now, what is so brilliant about Star Wars Destiny's design, of course, is that the designers realise this, and so they've given us the tools to be able to massively control and mitigate that randomness in how we use our cards and in how we build our decks and what cards we include. So with that in mind, and having sort of iterated how important strategy is and how we then need to bear it in mind when we're deck building, let's have a look at some of the possible strategies that you might be employing in a deck. So first of all, there are deck archetypes that we might talk about, and the first one we could look at would be an aggro strategy. So an aggro strategy is something where you are trying to deal as much damage as quickly as possible. So what you need to do when you are building your deck then, of course, is if that's your overarching strategy, well, you need to be bearing that in mind. So all of the decisions that you make about what cards to include, you need to ask yourself, since my strategy is to dish out as much damage as possible, it's aggro, are all my cards in the deck helping me to do that? Are they all leaning in that direction? Are they either bringing damage to the table or helping me to bring damage to the table and enabling another character to, or so on and so forth? So for instance, clearly rifles and lightsabers and those kind of upgrades are going to help you to put damage onto the table. But what you've also got to remember is it can't be just all that. You've also got to have the economy of your deck to take that into account, and can you afford to pay for all of these really cool ways of dishing out damage. So that's one strategy that you could be applying to your deck. Another one, of course, in this game is mill. You could be trying to mill your opponent out, i.e. they have no cards left to draw at the start of their next turn, and so they lose that way. So if you're going to play a deck like that, that has to be a deck that all the choices again in your deck you're looking at, well, does this play towards my mill strategy? And a fundamental part of a mill strategy would be not dying, your character's not dying. Now you could say that's a fundamental part of any strategy, but it becomes more important when what you're trying to do is to string the game out over a longer period of time. By its very nature, a milling strategy is going to take a longer time than an aggro strategy, because an aggro strategy, the whole aim is to get it over and done with quickly. A mill, we want it to take quite a bit of time. So again, you're looking at your deck and thinking, are all the cards that I'm putting in here, are they helping me to stay in the game for longer? Are they helping me to move towards this mill win condition? And then another big deck archetype that we could talk about would be control. Now what's very interesting is that essentially you could almost say that maybe control goes slightly in the middle of mill and aggro. You know, a mill deck will probably need to have some controlling elements, because the mill deck's got to keep itself alive for a long time. And that's what we're trying to do with a control deck. Most control decks are essentially trying to, if I could put it in a nutshell, they're trying to say, no you don't. And they're the ones who decide what's allowed to happen on the tabletop. So you decide, yeah, I don't mind taking that 2 damage there, but when someone then rolls 5 damage, you go, no, you're not going to do that. And you have cards or dice or some way of manipulating the game state to stop that damage coming in. And that's the kind of the heart, if you like, of a control strategy. It's more difficult generally to play control strategies. There are a lot more decisions to make, because you still have to decide, how am I going to win this? Is this a control mill deck, or is this a control aggro deck where you're actually trying to still kill off the other characters? So that one is a little harder, and if you're a newer player, I'd probably encourage you to lean more towards aggro to begin with. It's a generally easier strategy to build your decks with, because you can look at your cards and say, is it doing damage or is it helping me to do damage? I mean, it's pretty straightforward. And the decisions that you're making then, the tactics that you're employing in the game, are always, how can I do more damage, how can I do more damage? So it's a little more single-minded, and generally a more straightforward strategy to play. The other thing I just want to mention about control in this game is that, again, through the great design of it, there's actually a number of different ways that we can exert control. So yes, we can stop damage, we can be preventing damage, and most usually that's going to happen through either the dice that we've got in the on the table. So I'm thinking Sith, blue abilities, immobilize, force choke, or we could say force throw. That's a neutral one, I know, but those are the kind of those are dice upgrades that we've got in play, where we're using our dice to mitigate the damage, to control the damage that's on the board. Or it could be card based, like event based. So I'm thinking, cards like use the force, or he doesn't like you, or feel your anger, ways of controlling the damage simply by playing out your event cards. So there are other ways, of course, of controlling the game. You can be doing discard. Discard is a powerful way to control in this, and ultimately, again, it still leads to probably less damage incoming, because if you think about the flow of a general round in Destiny, people are rolling their dice and then they're discarding cards, re-rolling a few dice, and then they're maybe discarding another card, and then they're maybe just re-rolling 2 dice, and they're trying to hone their results down to the most amount of damage that they can do, for instance. It would be the simplest way of how many decks would try and play. So if you have any ways of discarding their cards, then your opponents are going to really then struggle, because they're going to have less options. Now, the other way, of course, that I think is probably not quite as strong yet, but it could become a real viable strategy to use in future decks, and that's the disrupt, denying your opponent resources. Now, at the moment, it doesn't seem super strong in and of itself. There are some strong disrupting type characters like Jabba, but ultimately people generally can have ways of playing or using up their resources with their first action of the round, and it's very difficult then to disrupt them and get rid of their resources entirely. Red military seems to be one of the best ways of doing it. I'm thinking cards like occupation or local garrison. You know, these are ways of controlling our opponent and their resources, but they're probably not quite there yet at the moment, at this early stage of the game. But it is a way of controlling the game that the designers have built in, so it is an aspect we do need to bear in mind. So these are some of the big strategies that are out there, the big general deck archetypes that are what the deck is trying to do. Now what I'm going to offer up for you to try, almost like a little exercise that you can run through with your decks when you're picking your cards and when you are identifying your strategy, is actually to use a principle that I'm a personal trainer by trade. That's how I make a living. I train clients one-to-one in gyms and so on, and we do lots of goal setting. And within that we use a principle that's often used in business as well, and that's the SMART principle for goal setting. So we've got specific, measurable, achievable and realistic, and then some sort of time-based. Now I think this works brilliantly well when it comes to the strategy that you use when it comes to deck building. So let's have a look at how we might use it. So first of all, we want to be specific. So when you're looking at your strategy, have you picked one that's specific enough? Do you have a good, clear idea of what it is that you're trying to achieve? It's very difficult to throw a bunch of cards together and then just play that with just a sort of a general nebulous, well, I'm trying to do damage, because it's not really a clear enough strategy. It's not a specific enough strategy. So make sure that from the outset that you've got a specific strategy in place. Secondly, measurable. What you want to be able to do is, after you've played a couple of matches maybe with your new deck, assess it. Are you able to see, are you able to measure whether your strategy is coming off or not? If you can't really know exactly, well, yes, I've achieved it, or no, I haven't, it's very difficult for you then to assess your deck, to assess the cards you've got in it, to make any changes. So being able to, excuse me, effectively measure your strategy and to see whether it's coming off, it is again a fundamental part of you of building a deck and then improving it and seeing it sort of go anywhere. Now thirdly, I've got achievable and fourthly, realistic. I'm going to put these two together, because when you're looking at your strategy and what you're trying to do, most of us are going to pick an achievable strategy. You're not going to pick something that's impossible to do. You know, if we're saying, well, I want to do an aggro deck and dish out lots of damage, okay, great, well, that's clearly achievable. The question is, how are you choosing to do that, and is that realistic? And that's really the question. Can it realistically be done? There was a really good example I saw the other day of a newer player who had I hope he's a new player, had put a deck together, and he described his strategy for the deck as being to reliably get either a launch bay or Millennium Falcon onto the table on turn 1, and then essentially use it as a beat stick to win the game with. Now, I would argue that that's only barely achievable. It's hard work building any deck that has any sort of consistency to get 5 resources together to be able to play out a card like that and nothing else. That's huge and very difficult. If you then add to the fact that this is something that, is it really realistic? It may be achievable, it is possible, but it's not realistic. He's not realistically going to be able to get out a round 1 Millennium Falcon or launch bay every single game. So that becomes a real big problem for that strategy. It's just not a realistically achievable strategy on a regular basis. And then of course finally, time. What you're looking at there is what are the time issues of how I play my deck? Is it a fast deck? Is it a quick deck? and you may be looking at your cards and looking at them saying, well, this might be a great card for doing damage, but actually it's going to be really difficult for me to get that into play. I'm going to need lots of resources, and that's really going to slow my deck down overall. I.e., if you're trying to put a launch bay in, or a big expensive ATST, well, yes, they can do loads and loads of damage, and you might say that's a good damage card. Whether it's a good aggro card, or you have to, that's much more difficult, because aggro wants to be fast, and if you're trying to get together 4, 5, 6 resources, that's a real challenge. So when you're adding cards to your deck and you're looking at your overall deck strategy, you're always able to run your choices through that little filter, the SMART filter: specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-based. Does it all add up? Okay, so there's just a few thoughts on the strategy of putting together your decks. Now, hopefully you found those helpful. Can I absolutely encourage you, if you have any particular insights or anything on the strategy of deck building, and I'll do a little bit more on tactics and other aspects of deck building in future videos, but please do add them to the comments on this video. Remember, I'm really keen for these videos to be a bit of a learning resource for the whole of the community, especially for new players who are joining the game and trying to work out how the heck do I do this really cool game that I've found myself getting into. Anyway, get building decks, get working out strategies, and keep enjoying Destiny. Until next time, see ya.